Good evening and welcome to the rest of the news. We have a tremendous program lined up for you this evening. Our special guest is Peter Sprigg with the Family Research Council. He's Skyped in from Washington, D.C. And here in the studio, our special guest is Ed Holloway, a former state representative. And we're certainly very honored to have both of them with us. Mr. Sprigg, if you can, I can't get over how shocked I was to learn that Eric Holder has apparently issued some kind of ruling that transgender people are going to be able to enter the women's restrooms.
Yeah. It's all under the Title VII. They use as the hammer to save the Civil Rights Act, which actually didn't cover that type of thing at all, but they're using that. And then the only way to stop it is to file a suit, and you end up with the Congress. It would be the only one that could ultimately stop it, and it's being blocked left and right.
It's ironic that we've kind of got the roles reversed here, because Congress shouldn't have to stop it, because the administration should not go beyond doing things that have already been authorized by statutes that have been passed by Congress. But what we have essentially, often we complain about judges legislating from the bench, which is not their role within our separation of powers. Well, here you have the executive branch legislating from the White House or from the Justice Department, which is not their role either. Legislating is supposed to be done by Congress at the federal level, and yet, as you said, we're seeing this where you have a law that was passed way back in 1964 by Congress, the Civil Rights Act of 1964, which prohibited discrimination, employment discrimination in particular, on the basis of race, but also had sex in there as a protected category as well. And those who have studied the history say that, ironically, the sex was added in by someone who opposed the bill in an effort to have it be a poison pill that would prevent the passage of the bill, but instead it was passed with race and sex as protected categories. But, of course, at the time, everyone understood, it was perfectly clear that what was meant by sex was not discriminating against a man because he was a man or against a woman because she was a woman. In particular, the latter, because of the perception that women's opportunities had been limited by discrimination.
Exactly.
But now, there have on occasion been court decisions since then which have said, well, sex discrimination can include something they call gender stereotyping. In other words, if you fire a woman from the job because you say, well, you're just not feminine enough, that kind of gender stereotyping can be considered a form of sex discrimination. Well, okay, maybe. But now Eric Holder and the Justice Department are trying to take this concept of gender stereotyping to the most extreme and really absurd degree, and saying, well, it's gender stereotyping to think that someone who is biologically male should call himself a man, or should not call himself a woman and dress like a woman. And it's gender stereotyping to say someone that's biologically female should not call themselves a male or a man and dress like a man. Therefore, they are claiming that this discrimination against discrimination on the basis of sex, which was outlawed by the 1964 Civil Rights Act, also encompasses discrimination based on so-called gender identity, which of course was nowhere within the legislative intent of the people who adopted that law in 1964.
Well, this is the thing that's really upsetting, is because I know there was a recent study that conducted percentages of people that were into these various categories of gay and transvestites and all the rest of the things that are part of this, and it's a very, very small percentage. The actual number of homosexuals, for example, is a very small number. I think you may have remembered the memo that was actually conducted by the federal government,
That's right. There was a study done just within, I think it was just within the last year or so, which was very significant because this was a large national survey, well-established methodology, and I believe it's called the National Health Interview Survey. And they've added a question about sexual orientation, which hasn't always been part of that survey. And when they released that data, they found that only 1.6% of American adults self-identify themselves as homosexual. Now, there's a certain smaller percentage that might call themselves bisexual, but even if you combine both of those categories, it's well under 3% of the population. This despite the fact that for years we've been told, based on misreading of Alfred Kinsey's research back in the 1940s, we've been told that 10% of the population is homosexual. And astoundingly, the Gallup poll has found that a majority of Americans think that over 20% of the American population is homosexual, probably because that's more like the percentage they may see on TV shows, for example. But the reality is, it's not, the percentage of homosexuals in the population is not 1 in 5, it's not 1 in 10, it's more like 1 in 60 Americans are homosexual. And then when you get to the transgender issue, the numbers are even smaller. I don't think I've ever seen an estimate higher than perhaps 1/2 of 1%, maybe even 3/10 of 1% as an estimate of the transgender population. These kind of changes, all of these efforts to add gender identity as a protected category and so forth are making a big deal about an extremely small number of people within the population.
Well, I think you hit on a very, very sound point about what the media and other entities are doing in terms of projecting this. And we get it constantly here, the legislature and others being support gay marriages and all the other things that are coming there, and the protesters. You would get the impression, the average person would, that half of the population is gay.
Yeah.
And then you're right. And this is all part of the propaganda to constantly promote this breakdown of the constitutional rights of Americans. And it's a very alarming thing. We were just talking before the program about where can we go to reverse some of this misinformation that's being circulated. And I think there was one of the key things that Porter Goss said that when he was head of the CIA, that the biggest threat to American security was a 1 or 2 square mile area called Washington, D.C. And this is where they're getting all of this, and nothing's going through Congress, and it's a very alarming thing. And I think you're exactly right with the percentage of the population that believe all these things.
This ruling does it really allow cross-dressing people to go into, say, a cross-dressing man to go into the girls' restroom at the public schools?
Well, the reason why this would implicate or may likely implicate the use of restrooms and so forth is because of the public accommodations provisions. Non-discrimination laws at the federal and state level usually involve several different categories of economic transaction generally, and so they will forbid discrimination in employment, in housing, so purchasing real estate or in renting an apartment and so forth. And the other area is public accommodations. Now, even the concept of public accommodations has kind of been expanded when it was originally adopted in 1964. The main concern was that African Americans who traveled in the South, for instance, were not able to eat at the same restaurants that white people did, and not able to stay in the same hotels or motels that white people did. That was what was considered public accommodation. But the concept of public accommodation is kind of expanded to include virtually any sort of commercial establishment and any kind of facility that's open to the public, including public restrooms. And so what this means is that it would be considered a form of discrimination to prevent someone from using the restroom that corresponds to their gender identity. In other words, that the restroom that corresponds to what they say they are or what they think they are, rather than what their body says that they actually are, in terms of their sex. So, and one thing that's important to realize is that it is not politically correct in the transgender community to ask whether someone has actually had what's called sex reassignment surgery or gender reassignment surgery to actually alter the features of their body to make them look like the opposite of their biological sex. You are just supposed to accept whatever the person says they are as being what they are. So the problem is you may have a man who is fully male who still has forgive me for being a little explicit, but who still has male genitalia and so forth, using the women's restroom. And I think it's perfectly reasonable and understandable that a lot of women, real women who are born female, would feel uncomfortable with that, would feel uncomfortable with sharing the sex-segregated facility of a restroom or particularly of a locker room or a shower at a health club, for example, sharing that with someone who is biologically male in every way but calls themselves female.
I've talked to some high school boys that are involved in athletics, and there have been several rulings now that allow females to participate in formerly traditionally male sports, football, basketball, and others, that you can't discriminate against them. And they were laughing about it. These teenage boys were laughing about it because they can't wait till Betty and Sue comes into the locker room and then we go into the showers together. And they find it's very humorous from a teenage boy standpoint that they could be able to do that. And this is a part of the other part of breakdown of all of the traditional American system, and it's very alarming. And again, it's part of the media is saying, well, if you're a high school male teacher and you feel that you're a transgender, you can dress as a woman, come and teach class. And this is another part of this, and the political correctness about you can't, that's an invasion of privacy if you ask them if they have any surgical change in their body or anything else. So.
Right. And the other concern that people have raised, I mean, people will refer to this as these bills as bathroom bills and so forth because of this implication, because I think to the general public, this is one of the more alarming implications of this type of bill. But the other thing that's been raised is even the concerns for the safety particularly of girls and women in the restroom. And I want to emphasize that what we're saying is not that transgender people are going to commit sexual assaults. What we're saying is that that people who are sexual predators may pretend to be transgender in order to gain access to these private facilities where women and girls are found, and no one will be willing to stop them. Nobody will be willing to prevent them from entering the women's facility because they fear being accused of discrimination. So that is where the concern about not just the comfort level, but the actual safety of women and girls has been raised.
Peter, that was a very good point, because there's very few people that have ever thought about that at that level, and that's exactly right. The predators are looking at this as an opportunity. There's absolutely no surveillance that takes place inside those restrooms, so nobody can ever know, and it's their word against the other one. And there again, we're back to that catch-22, I call it, that the individual has no rights at all, and the parents especially. And this is one of the things that are causing a major battle in those that are talking about all of the problems that the educational system is imposing on their children.
Peter, is there anything that the Family Research Council can do at this point to try to protect the public from what's going on with this bill or this ruling?
Well, basically, what the Justice Department is doing is saying this is the position that we are going to take when a case arises. But that Justice Department doesn't necessarily have the final word on this. So if there is a court case, for example, if someone is accused of discrimination, they have recourse to the court system, and the view of the Department of Justice will just be one opinion, but it will not necessarily be the decisive opinion in adjudicating a particular case. So, we've kind of spoken out to express our concerns. Certainly people in the legal profession, people who deal with discrimination claims need to be aware of this. But, I want to mention something else that already people are looking ahead to the 2016 presidential election and so forth. And this is the type of thing that needs to be asked of candidates for president as they make their case to the American people.
Right.
There are a lot of things that the Obama administration has done or is trying to do just through executive order or through their own interpretation of the law and regulations. And it's very important that if a conservative president is elected in 2016, they have to take firm action to reverse these steps. These actions will not reverse themselves. Many in the permanent Washington bureaucracy probably support this type of policy. So we will have to have strong commitments from any conservative presidential candidates that they will take the action necessary, not only that they will not take actions like this that make things worse, but that they will undo what has been done by the Obama administration.
This was one of the things, Peter, when I heard Senator Cruz, when he announced for president, he said the first job he will do the first day he is elected president and in office, he will reject every one of those executive orders that have created a lot of these problems. And I'd like to hear that from every candidate.
Right. And I mean, there are some things, other issues that will get more attention, like the Obama policy on immigration, for example, will get a lot more attention, or even the adopting policies and implementing Obamacare that violate the text of the law that was the Affordable Care Act. That gets a lot of attention. The media, especially the mainstream media, doesn't like to pay as much attention to things like, the Justice Department saying that gender identity is the same as sex in terms of discrimination. But we need to make sure that our candidates and our next president do pay attention to these issues as well as the ones that get more public attention.
Well, this is one thing that the average citizen can do, and that is to communicate with these candidates and get them to let them know that this is where the majority of the American public feels and things that need to be done.
Right. It's ironic that, too, that, the Justice Department is adopting this sort of expansive interpretation of existing law at the same time that they're supporting new legislation that would actually put sexual orientation and gender identity into the law as protected categories. The Employment Non-Discrimination Act would make those protected categories in employment law. There's something called the Student Non-Discrimination Act, which would make those protected categories in education. And it's important for citizens to contact their members of Congress as well and let them know that they oppose this kind of social engineering, that sexual orientation and gender identity should not be protected categories in any area. Now, let me emphasize, that doesn't mean that homosexuals and transgenders are not protected by the law, but they don't have special protections by virtue of being homosexual or transgender. They should just have the same protections against violence, for example, against violence and assault, the same protections that any other citizen has just by virtue of being a citizen.
Exactly, and I'm waiting to see how the Supreme Court will rule on this gay marriage issue that's before them now, and they're due to rule on that in the near future.
Well, that's right. I mean, all eyes are on the Supreme Court. Certainly that's taking up a lot of my attention, anticipating that ruling. I disagree with the people who say it's inevitable that the court will rule in favor of same-sex marriage. I think there are strong precedents, including strong precedents written by Justice Kennedy, who is considered the swing vote on the court, that would argue against the Supreme Court redefining marriage. But if they do take that step, which a lot of people are predicting, then we will face a whole new environment and a much more challenging one for the pro-family movement and for religious liberty in particular. I think we're going to see the clashes between religious liberty and the homosexual movement only rise to a much higher level.
Now, Peter, we've been told that only about half of the Christian people in America are voting, or maybe even less. And it seems to me that this is a good reason for our listeners to realize that it's important to vote and to register. We're getting ready to go into a primary election in the deadline is less than a month away. And we need to have voter registration in the churches, voter registration everywhere, and try to inform people how critical it is that we be able to vote on these crucial issues, or the candidates that are making the decisions.
Yes, it's very important. Of course, it's important for people to educate themselves on the issues as well. I mean, but getting registered is a crucial first step, so that at least you have a vote, and then to educate yourself on the candidates before the election. I know I just mentioned that because I know some people, I think that I read that President Obama had suggested that voting be made mandatory. And I don't support making voting mandatory, because if a person chooses not to vote, in a sense, that's one way of expressing their opinion. But and we don't necessarily want our officials to be elected by the most ignorant members of the public. Those who have chosen not to educate themselves maybe shouldn't vote. But we would certainly hope that Christians whose religious liberty is on the line, whose values have been under attack for decades now, that they would recognize the importance of this and register, educate themselves on the issues and the candidates, and then turn out on election day.
Well, you're exactly right, and it's a critical thing. And because an average person who thinks, well, my vote doesn't matter, and I don't like either candidate, it's more of a problem of going back to the basics and working in these primaries. And this is the critical thing: less than 10% of the people are selecting some of these candidates that have a completely opposite religious viewpoint than the average Christian in America. And this is the big problem. And if the Christian community would get together and vote in these primaries to select candidates who feel the same way they do in terms of religious freedom and the constitutional benefits that were provided by the Founding Fathers, then we would not have half of these problems that we have with these kind of appointments and others that are coming from some of these left-wing characters that are elected.
Right, and you know, people say, well, my vote doesn't really matter, but you never know which election is going to end up being one of those razor-thin elections that can change the course of history, like George W. Bush winning Florida in 2000 by 500-some votes. Right here in the D.C. area, I'm very conscious of the surrounding states in Maryland and Virginia. Well, in Virginia, the new Attorney General, they elected a liberal Democrat as Attorney General last year by just a razor-thin margin of a few hundred votes. And I think about Virginia, a state which does have a large Christian population. If only one more person from every church in the state had voted for the more conservative candidate, they would have had a completely different outcome, which would have meant that Virginia would have continued to fight to defend their marriage amendment, defining marriage as the union of a man and a woman. Instead, the new Attorney General just capitulated to the courts on that issue. On the other hand, in Maryland, where I happen to live, which is considered a very blue state, a liberal state, we had an upset where the Republican Larry Hogan defeated the Democrat Anthony Brown in our gubernatorial election last year, because the Democrat was not successful in turning out his base voters. So that election turnout can be crucial, and it can change the course of government and of history.
You're exactly right. In fact, there's a number of cases that I could recall that one vote in each precinct would have changed the outcome dramatically.
Right.
Just one, and that's a case that you could use to say that my vote doesn't count. It does count. Just one vote per precinct would change the outcome of the general election.
Peter, I've heard different numbers. Is it about half the Christians that are voting, or a quarter of the Christians that are voting?
Had any kind of opinion about that?
You know, I don't have firm numbers on that. And one time when this came up a few years ago, I tried to track down whether there were some firm numbers, and it's a little hard to know for sure. First of all, how do you define who is a Christian voter, and then how do you identify, you know, how many are registered and how many voted? I mean, there's two problems. There's the question of a certain percentage of the population not even being registered to vote. And then you have the voter turnout issue of whether those who were registered turned out to vote. But it's hard to pin down an exact number, but there's no question. The broad point that we're making is that if we could increase turnout of knowledgeable Christian voters, it would certainly make a difference.
Well, you've made a very, very valid point, because what I've run into in my studies of some of the individuals that I know and others is that the ministers in America now have been intimidated and threatened with the loss of tax-exempt status for their church if they mention anything about politics from the pulpit and all that. And it's up to the individual members of that congregation to step forward and make comments and stay in the environment of the church where the pastor feels that he's not permitted to say anything. May help.
Peter, here's a bumper sticker. Can you read that?
Together under God, invincible.
That kind of goes along with what we were saying about Christians need to get registered and informed and vote. And we have a bunch of these, and we'd be glad to send them to our listeners if they would call our phone number 893-2444, and we'd be glad to send you one of these. That number again, 893-2444, and they can call right now, and if no one answers the phone, you just leave your message on the answering machine. We'll get it right out to you. But this opinion, I guess is the word to use, of Eric Holder is not law at this point. Is that right?
Well, it's not necessarily going to be automatically be a law that will be applied nationwide, but certainly transgender people who want to make a case, make an accusation of discrimination, will undoubtedly rely upon that opinion in support of their claims, and it will the final outcome will to a large extent depend on how, in some cases, how a judge decides the issue.
Certainly appreciate Peter Sprigg and Ed Holloway, and tune in again next week for the rest of the news.